It was supposed to be a perfect summer getaway, a peaceful camping trip with family, a time to reconnect and make memories. My mom, as usual, promised us that it would be simple and low-key. Only small gifts for everyone, she had said with a smile, clearly excited to spend time together. After years of feeling like I was constantly putting my family's needs before my own, I held on to hope that this trip would be different. That maybe, just maybe, it would be the one time I'd feel truly seen. But when the gift exchange finally came, I couldn't ignore the glaring disparity. My sister's kids, Molly and Tolly, were given shiny new bicycles, expensive and perfectly wrapped, something that clearly took thought and effort. Meanwhile, my daughter, Chloe, just 7 years old, was handed a plain, cheap cap. I watched as Chloe tried to smile, holding her cap in her lap, but the disappointment in her eyes was unmistakable. It was a moment that broke something inside me. The promise of small gifts had been a lie. It wasn't just the gifts that hurt, it was the years of feeling invisible in my own family, and that was the last straw. What was supposed to be a fun family camping trip quickly turned into a harsh awakening. My mom's empty promises, and the years of emotional neglect, became impossible to ignore. And in that moment, I knew something had to change. For Chloe's sake and my own, I made a decision that would change everything. I chose to walk away from a family that had never truly seen me. As Megan pulled into the long gravel driveway leading to her mother's cabin, a familiar mix of excitement and apprehension swirled in her chest. The cabin sat nestled among tall pine trees, the mountains looming in the distance like silent guardians. It had always been a place for family get-togethers, and while Megan cherished these memories, there was always a subtle tension hanging in the air, one that had been there for as long as she could remember. Chloe, her 7-year-old daughter, leaned forward from the back seat, her face pressed against the window, eyes wide with excitement. "Look, Mom, the cabin's just like the pictures," she exclaimed, her voice full of wonder. Megan smiled, hoping that this time would be different, that this trip would help heal the fractures in her relationship with her family, especially her mother, Sharon. When they finally arrived, Megan was greeted by the usual warm smiles from her mother and sister, Tara. But there was an undercurrent to the greetings, an edge to the smiles that Megan knew all too well. Sharon's eyes lingered on Chloe for just a beat too long, a momentary glance that quickly flickered away. Tara's hug, though tight, felt perfunctory, like it was done out of obligation rather than affection. Megan had grown used to this subtle coldness over the years. It wasn't that they were openly hostile, but there was always something unspoken that kept her at arm's length. As they unloaded their bags, Megan noticed that her sister was already involved in organizing the tents and setting up camp, as if it were her responsibility. Sharon, with a knowing look, waved Megan over to help, offering no real assistance herself. Megan sighed internally. It always seemed to fall on her shoulders to make things run smoothly. She had long ago accepted this role within the family, always the one who did the work, who kept everything in order while Tara's life seemed to flow effortlessly. "Can you help Chloe with the firewood?" Sharon called out, her tone more demanding than requesting. Megan nodded, trying to push down the resentment that started to build. She could feel the familiar pang of being the one who was expected to handle the details, the tents, the meals, the fire, while everyone else seemed to drift through the day with little effort. Chloe, ever the optimist, scampered over to her mother with a bundle of sticks in her arms, eager to help. Megan smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair as they set up a small fire pit. But even as Chloe beamed with excitement, Megan couldn't help but notice the distance that was growing between her daughter and her cousins, Molly and Tolly. While Chloe tried to join in the games, Molly and Tolly were already deeply engaged in their own world, laughing at something Megan didn't quite hear, their focus only on each other. Chloe hesitated before taking a seat near them, her enthusiasm not as infectious as it usually was. She tried to speak up, but her words got lost as Molly and Tolly continued talking over her. Megan could see her daughter's bright energy begin to dim, and though she wanted to address it, she pushed the thought aside. "It's just the first day," Megan whispered to herself. "She'll warm up soon." But deep down she knew that it wasn't just about the first day. Chloe had always been the child who absorbed the emotions around her, even when Megan tried to shield her from the complexities of family dynamics. Megan tried to ignore it, pretending it was just an awkward beginning. But in her heart, she knew this trip was starting to feel just like all the others, full of promises that never quite lived up to their expectations. As the day wore on, Megan worked tirelessly to prepare dinner, all the while keeping an eye on Chloe, who continued to sit quietly, watching Molly and Tolly run around, too hesitant to join them. Megan felt the familiar sting of her own childhood, the sense that no matter how hard she tried to fit in, she was always just outside of the circle. And now, she was seeing the same thing happen to Chloe. The evening was settling in around the campfire as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the tree line. The warm glow of the fire flickered across the group, casting dancing shadows against the rustic cabin and the trees that surrounded them. The smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air, and the faint sound of crickets and rustling leaves created a calming backdrop to the family gathering. Despite the beauty of the moment, Megan couldn't shake the rising tension inside her. Her mother, Sharon, had called everyone together to announce the moment they had been waiting for, the gift exchange. As she stood up, her usual bright smile in place, she clapped her hands together, drawing everyone's attention. "Okay, everyone, it's time for the small gifts I promised. I hope you're all ready for a little surprise." Megan felt a strange mix of excitement and anxiety wash over her. Her mother had promised small gifts for everyone, something simple but meaningful. Megan tried to hold on to the hope that, this time, her mother would make an effort to follow through. Maybe this trip would finally be different, a chance to feel valued. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nervous tightness in her chest. Could she really trust Sharon? Would this just be another empty promise, another reminder that her family never truly saw her or Chloe for who they were? As Sharon began pulling small bags from the corners of the campfire, Megan's eyes darted to Chloe, who was sitting beside her, her face lit with anticipation. Chloe had been looking forward to the gift exchange for days. She had even talked about what she might get, imagining all the little things she might receive: a cute toy, some stickers, maybe even a little art set. She was excited to see what Grandma had picked out for her. Megan tried to push aside the knot in her stomach, hoping this would be one of those rare moments when her family exceeded her expectations. Sharon handed the first gift to Molly, her eldest granddaughter, with a smile that seemed a little too wide, a little too rehearsed. Molly tore the paper off eagerly, and the gasp of excitement that followed sent a ripple of discomfort through Megan. A shiny, brand-new bicycle gleamed under the firelight as Molly's eyes widened in delight. "Well, don't just stand there. Go take it for a spin," Tara said with a laugh, her voice filled with pride. Molly jumped up immediately, her excitement infectious as she rushed to the nearby open space, eagerly showing off her new bike. Tolly was next. The moment Sharon handed him his gift, he also tore into the wrapping paper with a grin, his face lighting up when he saw a brand-new bicycle, matching Molly's. Tara beamed with pride as Tolly enthusiastically hopped on his new bike, pedaling around the campsite with unrestrained joy. Megan's heart sank, and she could feel the weight of the moment settling heavily on her chest. The bikes, expensive and shiny, were a far cry from the small gifts her mother had promised. It wasn't just the cost that stung, it was the glaring favoritism. The complete disregard for how this moment would make her and Chloe feel. Chloe, who had been eagerly watching the gift exchange, now sat still, her hands nervously fiddling with the edges of her dress. Her excitement, once bright, had dimmed. Megan glanced at her daughter, her heart aching as she saw Chloe's small face fall. It was subtle, but it was there. Chloe's eyes, once wide with anticipation, now held a quiet confusion. She wasn't jumping up to unwrap her gift. She wasn't even asking what was in the bag. She had already guessed. When it was Chloe's turn, Sharon handed her a small, off-brand cap, wrapped in cheap, crinkly paper. Chloe's fingers slowly peeled back the layers of paper, revealing the cap. She stared at it for a moment, her face flickering between confusion and disappointment. She looked up at Sharon, then at her cousins, who were still excitedly riding their bicycles. "Thanks, Grandma," Chloe said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, the words forced. She tried to put on a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The cap, simple and unremarkable, wasn't what she had hoped for. It wasn't a thoughtful gift or a surprise. It was an afterthought. It was the one gift that made Chloe realize, in that brief, painful moment, that she wasn't as important as her cousins in her grandmother's eyes. Megan watched her daughter's reaction, her stomach twisting with guilt and helplessness. She wanted to say something, to tell Chloe that it didn't matter, that gifts weren't important, but the truth was, it did matter. It mattered because this wasn't about the cap. It was about how Chloe, just like Megan years ago, had been placed on the fringes of the family, never quite good enough, never quite seen. Megan's heart broke as Chloe quietly tucked the cap into her lap and began to fiddle with the fabric. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Chloe, so sensitive and perceptive, could feel the disparity in a way that Megan had hoped she would never have to. As the gift exchange came to a close and the laughter around the campfire grew louder, Megan sat still, a mix of anger and sadness rising within her. She had tried to convince herself that things would be different, that her family would finally show up for her and Chloe. But now, it was clear. This trip, this promise of small gifts, was nothing more than another hollow gesture, another reminder that she and her daughter would always be seen as second-class members of the family. Megan's mind raced as she fought to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. She had spent years excusing her family's behavior, pretending that it didn't hurt, convincing herself that she was being too sensitive. But this moment where Chloe's disappointment mirrored her own childhood experiences, was the final straw. For the first time, Megan saw her family for what they really were, a group of people who took and took, but never gave in return. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't keep pretending it didn't matter. It was time to face the truth. The weekend wore on, each day blending into the next as Megan struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the rising tension. While the surroundings, the calm lake, the chirping birds, the warmth of the campfire were beautiful, the emotional climate within the family felt increasingly hostile. Megan had always been able to ignore the small slights from her family, convincing herself that the dynamic was just the way things were. But now, with Chloe's growing discomfort mirroring her own silent struggles, Megan found herself unable to turn a blind eye any longer. As the days passed, Megan noticed her mother's favoritism toward Molly and Tolly in increasingly subtle ways. At every meal, Sharon piled their plates high with extra servings, making sure they had more than enough. The rest of the family, including Megan and Chloe, were given smaller portions. It wasn't blatant. There were no overt comments about how much Molly and Tolly deserved it, but the message was clear. Sharon lavished attention on them, making sure they were always well-fed, well cared for. Meanwhile, Chloe, who hadn't said a word about wanting more, was often told to wait her turn when asking for a second helping or simply asking for a glass of water. It wasn't just the food. As the days went by, Sharon couldn't seem to stop herself from heaping praise on her grandchildren. Every drawing Molly and Tolly made was displayed prominently. Every little story they told was met with exaggerated exclamations of delight. "Look at this beautiful drawing, Molly. You've got such a talented hand," Sharon would say, her voice filled with pride. "Tolly, you're getting so tall. You're going to be a great athlete one day, just like your father." Chloe, in contrast, barely received any acknowledgement. When she showed Grandma her sketches, Sharon would give a distracted nod, murmuring, "That's nice, sweetheart," before turning her attention back to her cousins. Megan could feel the heaviness in her daughter's eyes each time. She withdrew her drawings, silently retreating from the praise that was never hers to claim. The disparity between the way Sharon interacted with her grandchildren became undeniable. Chloe, usually so full of life, began to shrink into herself. Her usual enthusiasm for the outdoors, for exploring, and for playing with her cousins faded each day. On the second evening of the trip, Megan noticed that while Molly and Tolly ran off to explore the woods with their new bikes, Chloe quietly sat by the fire with her cap, watching them from a distance. She wasn't joining in. She wasn't laughing or asking to go along. Instead, she stared into the fire, her small shoulders hunched in a way that Megan had never seen before. "Chloe, honey, don't you want to go with them?" Megan asked gently, her heart aching as she watched her daughter retreat even further. Chloe hesitated, then shook her head. "They don't want me to come. They're having fun without me." Megan tried to console her, wrapping an arm around Chloe's shoulders, but she knew deep down that this was more than just a fleeting moment. Chloe wasn't the same joyful child she had been before the trip. She had begun to internalize something that Megan had always hoped she could shield her from, the belief that she wasn't enough. The same belief that had haunted Megan for years. Over the course of the weekend, Chloe withdrew more and more. She stopped seeking out her cousins for play, instead sitting silently by Megan's side, playing with pebbles or flipping through the book she had brought along. Megan had tried to coax Chloe into joining in, but her daughter's spirit seemed dimmed. It was as if the spark inside her was being snuffed out by the same coldness that Megan had grown used to. As the evening approached on the third day, Megan decided to confront the issue head-on. She found herself sitting across from Tara by the campfire, the flames flickering between them as the night grew darker. Tara had always been the one who seemed to brush things off, pretending that everything was fine when, in reality, nothing ever was. "I'm really worried about Chloe," Megan said quietly, looking over at her daughter, who sat with her arms crossed, staring blankly at the fire. She's been so quiet, so distant. It's like she doesn't want to be here." Tara rolled her eyes slightly, the familiar dismissive tone slipping into her voice. "Oh, Megan, come on. You're overthinking it. She's just adjusting to being away from home. It's not a big deal." But Megan couldn't ignore the pang of frustration that flared inside her. Tara's casual dismissal of Chloe's feelings, her inability to see the problem, only deepened the wound. "I don't think it's just that, Tara," Megan said, her voice tight. "Chloe's been watching how Grandma treats Molly and Tolly. She's seen how they get all the attention, all the praise, while she's left in the background." Tara's face hardened. "Megan, you're being overly sensitive. Mom loves Chloe, you know she does." "Loves her, Tara?" Megan's voice shook with emotion. "How does she love her if she barely acknowledges her? How does she love her when she doesn't even give her the time of day when she shows her artwork? How does she love her if she always gives Molly and Tolly the best of everything?" Tara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly irritated. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. I'm sure it's not that bad. Just let it go." But Megan couldn't. She couldn't let it go any longer, not when she saw Chloe pulling further away from the world. Not when she saw the same patterns of neglect and emotional manipulation that had been present in their family for years, now being passed down to her daughter. Megan's frustration boiled over as she stood up, pacing slightly. "It's not nothing, Tara. You've never had to fight for anything in your life. You've never been overlooked like I have, and now Chloe's going through the same thing. It's heartbreaking. I'm done pretending this is okay." Tara's silence was deafening, and Megan could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. For the first time, she felt the full weight of the emotional disregard that had been festering in her family for years. Tara's inability to see the problem, her refusal to even acknowledge how Megan felt, was the final straw. Megan had always been the one to silently carry the emotional load for everyone, but now she realized that carrying that weight for Chloe was a fight she couldn't afford to lose. As the evening wore on, Megan made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let her daughter feel invisible any longer. Not in this family, not in this life. And if she had to fight for it, she would, for Chloe's sake. The last night of the trip had arrived, and the family gathered around the campfire, a familiar ritual that always marked the end of their time together. The flames flickered brightly, casting warm, golden light across the group, their laughter filling the cool evening air. Sharon, Tara, and the kids were in the center, laughing together, their voices high-pitched and joyful as they swapped stories and inside jokes. Molly and Tolly had found a rhythm in their sibling dynamic, cycling around the camp, showing off their new bikes, while Sharon clapped and cheered them on. Megan and Chloe, however, sat at the fringes of the campfire's glow. Chloe, her cap still perched awkwardly on her head, sat cross-legged on the ground, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Her shoulders were hunched, her face a mixture of concentration and quiet sadness. Megan could feel the tension in the air between them, the unspoken divide. The warmth of the campfire couldn't reach the cold distance between them and the rest of the family. Megan wanted to be part of the laughter, to join in, the stories and the fun, but she knew she didn't belong there. She could feel it in the way her mother looked past her, in the way Tara never made an effort to include her. It was as if they were in their own world, one that Megan and Chloe were never invited into. She watched as Molly and Tolly, oblivious to the impact of their actions, continued to bask in their newfound attention. And there, in the corner of her eye, was Chloe, her sweet, sensitive daughter, carrying the weight of the same emotional neglect Megan had carried for years. Chloe's small hand moved absent-mindedly through the dirt, her stick drawing shapes that meant nothing, but everything at the same time. Megan's heart broke as she watched her daughter's quiet withdrawal. Chloe, usually full of life and curiosity, had become a shadow of herself, hiding her feelings behind a mask of stoicism. Chloe had always been so eager to please, always trying to fit in and be seen. But now, like Megan before her, she was beginning to understand that in this family, there was no space for her, no matter how hard she tried. It was in this moment that Megan's internal struggle reached its peak. The emotional tension had become unbearable. She had spent so many years trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to earn her mother's love and approval. She had sacrificed her time, energy, and even her own sense of self to fit into the mold her family expected her to fill. She had always believed that if she just tried harder, gave more, and loved more, they would eventually see her. But now, watching her daughter silently suffer in the same way, Megan realized that this would never change. For years, she had excused the subtle manipulation and neglect, convincing herself that it was just how things were. But now, With Chloe sitting beside her, drawing shapes in the dirt, Megan saw the painful truth. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself to be the one who held everything together. She couldn't keep bending to her family's expectations at the expense of her own well-being and, more importantly, her daughter's. Megan's mind raced as she struggled with the emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to shout, to tell Sharon and Tara everything she had been holding inside for years. But the words seemed too painful to say, too final, and yet she couldn't ignore it any longer. The hurt, the bitterness, the years of pretending that everything was okay, it was all coming to a head. And the worst part was that she could no longer pretend for Chloe. She could no longer stand by and let her daughter grow up in a family that didn't value her. As the laughter around the campfire continued, Megan made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stay. Not just for the night, but for good. The camping trip was over, but so was her relationship with her family. She would not spend another moment tolerating the emotional neglect, the favoritism, and the constant feeling of being less than. She wasn't going to allow herself or Chloe to be invisible anymore. Taking a deep breath, Megan turned to Chloe, who was still drawing shapes in the dirt, her face unreadable. "Chloe," Megan said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We're leaving. We're going home." Chloe looked up at her, her expression still quiet, but something in her eyes softened. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. Chloe knew. Megan could see it in her daughter's face. Chloe had known all along what Megan was too afraid to admit. They both had. Megan stood up, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her chest. It wasn't just about leaving the camping trip, it was about leaving behind the toxic dynamic that had shaped her entire life. For the first time, Megan was making a choice for herself, and for Chloe. A choice to walk away from a family that didn't see them for who they truly were. A family that took and took, without ever giving anything in return. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Megan felt a sense of relief flood over her. The path ahead would be difficult, but she was finally free. Free from the expectation that she had to sacrifice herself for a family that would never appreciate her. Free to rebuild her life, to give Chloe the love and security she deserved, away from the emotional wounds that had been passed down through generations. The fire crackled behind them as Megan and Chloe walked toward the car. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a chapter where they could finally be seen, finally be enough. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. The campfire from the night before was now just a scattering of glowing embers, and the air was cool and still. But within the quiet, Megan felt a rising sense of urgency. She moved around the campsite in the early morning, packing their belongings with a steady, practiced motion, careful not to wake Chloe yet. The weight of the decision she had made the night before still sat heavily in her chest, but there was a new clarity in her mind. The path forward was no longer unclear. Chloe stirred in the tent as Megan zipped up the last of their bags, the rustling of fabric pulling her attention. "Mom?" Chloe's voice was soft, still thick with sleep. Megan smiled down at her daughter, her heart swelling with love for the little girl who had been her rock throughout it all. "We're leaving, sweetheart," she said, her voice low but steady. "We're going home." Chloe blinked up at her, confused but trusting. "Now?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "Yes, now," Megan replied, brushing a strand of hair out of Chloe's face. "It's time to go. We're going to start fresh." Chloe didn't argue or ask why. She simply nodded and slowly sat up, rubbing her eyes and yawning. She understood. They both understood. Now, the trip, the family, none of it was worth the hurt they both carried. Megan could see in Chloe's eyes that she, too, was ready to leave the weight of this family behind. Together, they quietly gathered their things, loading them into the car without much fanfare. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was a shared understanding. The air felt different, charged with the enormity of what they were about to do. Megan's hands trembled slightly as she folded a blanket and placed it in the trunk, the reality of leaving her family behind settling in. As they prepared to leave, Megan felt a presence behind her. She turned to see her mother, Sharon, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, a look of confusion and something else on her face. The sight of her mother, framed by the rising sun, sent a pang of guilt through Megan's chest. She hadn't expected Sharon to let them leave so easily. She had hoped, even after everything, that there would be a chance for reconciliation. But that hope had been shattered long ago, and now it was time to face the reality. "Megan," Sharon said, her voice tight with a mix of frustration and concern. "Why are you packing up? Why are you leaving early?" Megan took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. For years, she had silently endured the neglect, the favoritism, the emotional manipulation, hoping for change. But now, there was no more pretending. She couldn't keep living in the shadows of her family's indifference. "We're leaving because it's time," Megan said, her voice calm but firm. She could feel the weight of the words as they left her lips. "I'm done pretending that everything is fine. I'm done being the one who sacrifices everything for this family when no one ever sees me, when no one ever values what I do." Sharon took a step forward, her expression faltering. "What are you talking about? I don't understand. You and Chloe are family. We're just having a good time." Megan shook her head, her breath steady but rising in her chest. "A good time for who? Molly and Tolly? I've watched them get everything new bikes. Constant praise, and Chloe has barely been acknowledged. She was treated like an afterthought, and you never saw it. You never saw how much it hurt her." Sharon's face softened for a moment, but then she quickly regained her composure. "Oh, come on, Megan. Don't make this into something it's not. You're just being overly sensitive, as usual. We're family, and family sticks together." "Sticks together?" Megan repeated, her voice rising with emotion. "That's what you call this? Me doing everything while Tara gets praised, while Molly and Tolly are given everything they want? Where is the family when it's my turn? Where was the family when Chloe needed attention, when she needed love? You were too busy lavishing it all on them to even see her." Sharon's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Megan continued before she could say anything. "You can try to guilt me into staying, but I won't be manipulated anymore. I've spent years doing this, and it's not happening again. I'm choosing us, choosing Chloe. We're leaving, and I'm not coming back." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Sharon stood there, eyes flickering with frustration and confusion, but Megan didn't back down. For the first time, she wasn't afraid to stand her ground. "I've been the one who always fixed things. I always made the effort, gave everything, but I can't do that anymore," Megan said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Chloe and I are better off without this. We deserve better." Sharon opened her mouth as though to protest, but Megan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She wasn't going to fight anymore. She had nothing left to say. Without another word, Megan turned to Chloe, who was waiting by the car, her little suitcase clutched in her hands. Megan's heart broke with both sorrow and relief as she watched her daughter stand there, her eyes wide but full of trust. She nodded to Chloe, signaling that it was time to go. As they drove away from the campsite, the sun rising behind them, Megan felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. The familiar road stretched out in front of them, offering a path that was no longer defined by the shadows of her past. The weight of years of emotional neglect and sacrifice began to lift, and for the first time, Megan didn't feel the need to justify her decision. She wasn't walking away from her family for revenge. She was walking toward something far more important. She was walking toward herself and her daughter a new chapter, free from the toxic bonds that had held her down for so long. Chloe sat quietly beside her, looking out the window, and Megan felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This was the right decision. It was time to start fresh, and this time, Megan knew she wouldn't be sacrificing herself for anyone, not anymore. The days following their return home felt like a quiet rebirth. The house, which had once felt heavy with the weight of unresolved tension, now seemed filled with light. Megan could finally breathe, her chest no longer constricted by the constant emotional burden she had carried for years. Chloe, too, seemed to exhale with relief. There was no longer the underlying sense of neglect hanging over them. No unspoken expectations from a family that never truly saw them for who they were. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough a subtle shift that made all the difference. The first week back, Megan spent her time re-establishing a routine for both herself and Chloe, ensuring that they had a sense of security and normalcy. She took Chloe to the park every afternoon, making sure they spent quality time together, without the distractions of past obligations. It was simple, but it was exactly what they needed. One of the first things Megan did was enroll Chloe in an art class, something her daughter had always shown interest in but never had the chance to pursue. Chloe had always loved drawing and painting, but she had never felt encouraged to explore her creativity in the way she deserved. Megan smiled as she saw Chloe's eyes light up the first day they walked into the art studio. The space was bright, welcoming, and full of color, everything Chloe had been missing. She began to pour herself into her artwork, each brushstroke or pencil line a small act of reclaiming her identity. Megan was deliberate in how she shaped their new life. Every decision she made was centered around Chloe's happiness and well-being. She took Chloe to museums on weekends, where they would wander the exhibits, talking about the art, sharing ideas, and enjoying each other's company. These small moments began to create a new rhythm for them, one of love, respect, and mutual understanding. The house no longer felt like a place of emotional scarcity. It felt like a sanctuary they had built together. For Megan, this period of rebuilding wasn't just about taking care of Chloe, it was about rediscovering herself. She had spent so many years tending to the needs of others, sacrificing her own desires and passions in the process. But now, with the emotional weight of her family's neglect lifted, she had space to breathe again. Megan slowly began to reclaim the parts of herself she had buried for so long. She took up journaling, writing down her thoughts and feelings for the first time in years. It became a way for her to process everything that had happened, to make sense of her decision to leave and what she wanted for her future. With each page she filled, she felt herself becoming stronger, more in tune with who she was beyond the roles she had been forced to play in her family. Painting, too, became a part of Megan's life again. It had been something she loved as a child, a creative outlet she had set aside when life became too busy. She found an old easel in the attic and set up a corner of her living room for her art. The act of painting, of creating something from nothing, was freeing. It was her way of reconnecting with herself and her creativity, something she hadn't realized she'd missed until she picked up the brush again. In addition to her creative pursuits, Megan reconnected with old friends, the ones who had always appreciated her for who she truly was. She called up Sarah, a close friend from college, and invited her over for a cup of coffee. It had been years since they'd really talked, but it felt natural, like no time had passed at all. They shared stories of the past, of the dreams they'd had when they were younger, and of the realities they had both faced. Megan felt a sense of warmth and comfort she hadn't realized she was missing. As the days turned into weeks, Megan could see the transformation in Chloe as well. Her daughter was more confident, more outgoing, and more comfortable in her own skin. Chloe's new friends from the art class began to invite her to playdates and birthday parties, and Megan watched with pride as Chloe blossomed into a more independent, self-assured child. She was no longer the quiet, withdrawn little girl who had felt invisible. She was a child who was beginning to find her own voice, her own path. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Chloe looked up at her mother and said softly, "Mom, I like it here. It feels happy." Megan's heart swelled with pride. "Me too, sweetie," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's because we're making it happy. We've built this together." Chloe smiled, her eyes shining with a new kind of joy. "I think we can do anything now, just you and me." Megan nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Didn't try to hide. Yes, we can. Just you and me, kiddo. We can do anything." Chloe leaned against her, resting her head on Megan's shoulder, a sense of peace settling over them both. In that quiet moment, Megan realized just how much they had both changed. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled them. They had built something new, a life based on love, respect, and the understanding that they were enough, just as they were. The rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Megan had created a life for Chloe and herself, where they were seen, heard, and valued not just by each other, but by the world around them. And as they sat there, together, Megan knew that no matter what came next, they were stronger than ever. Weeks passed after Megan and Chloe left the camping trip, and though life at home had settled into a rhythm of peace, the ripples of their decision to walk away from the family were still being felt. Sharon and Tara, unable to accept the new reality, began reaching out. The calls started slowly, brief voicemails filled with words of concern, guilt, and, in Sharon's case, thinly veiled attempts to manipulate Megan into returning. The messages were laden with pleas, often reminding Megan of family bonds and accusing her of being too hasty, too harsh. Sharon's voice crackled with a mixture of hurt and frustration, while Tara's messages were more direct, often filled with a passive-aggressive tone, trying to guilt Megan by referencing how hard things were without her. "Why are you doing this, Megan? This isn't who you are. You can't just walk away from family. You've always been there for us." Sharon's voicemail echoed in Megan's mind, a twisted version of the words Megan had always longed to hear. Chloe needs to see how important family is. It's not too late to come back. Please, think about this. Tara's texts were even more blunt, each one more demanding than the last. This is ridiculous, Megan. You've been so dramatic. You can't seriously throw away everything we've built over something so small. Don't you care about us at all? The guilt Megan had always internalized for not meeting her family's expectations began to bubble to the surface. It took everything in her not to respond, not to go back into the familiar role she had played for so long, the dutiful daughter, the peacekeeper, the one who always tried to fix things, even at her own expense. But Megan had spent too long sacrificing herself for the sake of others' happiness. She wasn't going to do that anymore. She turned off her phone, putting it on silent for the first time in years, and sat on the couch, looking over at Chloe, who was busy working on a new drawing. It was a moment of quiet strength. Megan knew that despite the guilt being thrust upon her, this was the right decision for them. She didn't need her family's approval or validation anymore. They had never truly seen her for who she was. The love they had given was conditional, based on what Megan could offer them, not on who she truly was. As the days turned into weeks, Megan felt herself growing stronger. Her version of revenge wasn't one of retaliation, but one of independence. She wasn't seeking to hurt Sharon or Tara. Instead, she was choosing herself, choosing Chloe, and walking away from toxic relationships that had kept her in a perpetual state of compromise. The transformation was gradual, but it was unmistakable. Megan began to realize that the true victory was in finding her voice and asserting her right to live authentically. By stepping away from the people who had drained her for so long, Megan had made room for what truly mattered, her own well-being and the happiness of her daughter. For the first time in years, Megan wasn't adjusting herself to fit into the mold her family had created for her. She was building a new life on her own terms, one that was grounded in self-respect, love, and healthy boundaries. Chloe, too, was flourishing. Megan could see it in the way her daughter interacted with the world, more confident, more engaged, and more open to the future. Chloe had never been so vibrant, so full of potential. She had found her own voice as well, and Megan couldn't help but feel proud of how far they had come together. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, Chloe turned to her mother and smiled. "Mom, I'm really happy we're doing this. I like it here." "It's so peaceful." Megan smiled back, a warmth spreading through her chest as she took Chloe's hand. "Me too, sweetheart. It feels like we've finally found our place in the world." Chloe nodded, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. "I think we're going to be okay, just you and me." The weight that had once hung over them, the pressure of their family's expectations, was now a distant memory. Megan had learned to trust herself, to trust her instincts, and to make choices that prioritized their emotional health and happiness. And as they sat together, wrapped in the golden light of the setting sun, Megan realized that the journey of rediscovery had only just begun. They were finally free to build a life full of possibility, free from the toxic family dynamics that had kept them trapped for so long. As they sat there, watching the stars slowly begin to appear in the twilight sky, Megan felt at peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to look back. She had chosen herself and Chloe, and that was enough. They stood strong, side by side, ready to face whatever the future had in store. Their new life was grounded in love, respect, and emotional health. The shadows of the past no longer loomed over them. With each passing day, Megan felt more certain that the decision she had made was the right one that would lead to a fulfilling, authentic life, free from the burdens of her past. For the first time, Megan knew she had the power to shape her future. And with Chloe by her side, there was nothing they couldn't do. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Don't miss out on future content that could make a difference. Your support helps us reach more people and continue sharing these stories. Go ahead, hit subscribe now.